In this video, I list the top flaws people commonly admit, ranked in order of how easy they are to confess. I'll explain the underlying psychology and why these flaws are deemed safe for most people to reveal. Perfectionism. Why it's easy to admit. Perfectionism is the ultimate safe flaw because it often feels more like a disguised compliment than a shortcoming. When someone says, "I'm a perfectionist," they're essentially saying they have high standards and care deeply about outcomes. These traits are generally admired in society. Deeper perspective. Although perfectionism can lead to stress, indecision, and burnout, these negative aspects are rarely highlighted when people admit it. Instead, it positions them as hardworking, disciplined, and detail-oriented. Example: I tend to obsess over getting every detail just right, so it sometimes slows me down. Being too detail-oriented. Why it's easy to admit. This is essentially a lighter variation of perfectionism. It acknowledges a tendency to focus on details without sounding overly self-critical. Being detail-oriented is often seen as a strength in professional or academic settings. Deeper perspective. This admission rarely triggers judgment because paying attention to details is perceived as thoroughness, not a lack of capability. It's safe and relatable as many people have felt bogged down by minutiae. Example: I can get caught up in the small details, but it's because I want to make sure everything is accurate. Procrastination. Why it's easy to admit. Procrastination is one of the most relatable flaws. Virtually everyone has delayed tasks at some point, so admitting it doesn't feel isolating or risky. People often frame procrastination as a quirk rather than a serious issue. Deeper perspective. This flaw is often softened with justifications like, "I work best under pressure." By reframing procrastination as a strategic choice, it minimizes the perception of irresponsibility. Example: I sometimes put things off until the last minute, but I found I thrive under tight deadlines. Impatience. Why it's easy to admit. Impatience can be spun as a positive, portraying the individual as results-oriented or passionate about progress. It's often seen as a frustration with inefficiency rather than a personal failing. Deeper perspective. Admitting impatience subtly implies that the person values time and productivity, qualities that are respected in many contexts. Example: I can get impatient when things move too slowly, but it's because I'm eager to see results. Taking on too much. Why it's easy to admit. Overcommitting is a common struggle, particularly in workplaces or among goal-driven individuals. It shows ambition and a willingness to take responsibility, which can be reframed as dedication. Deeper perspective. This admission often garners sympathy rather than criticism, as it reflects external pressures rather than a lack of capability or judgment. Example: I tend to say yes to too many things because I want to help, but I'm learning to prioritize. Difficulty delegating. Why it's easy to admit. Struggling to delegate hints at trust issues, but it also suggests a strong sense of responsibility and high standards. It can be reframed as caring deeply about outcomes. Deeper perspective. This flaw is often linked to perfectionist tendencies, making it easier to admit without seeming overly vulnerable. Example: I have a hard time letting go of tasks because I want to ensure they're done right. Being too self-critical. Why it's easy to admit. Self-criticism is easy to share because it conveys humility and introspection. It frames the individual as reflective, which is generally admired. Deeper perspective. By admitting self-criticism, people acknowledge their imperfections in a way that feels sincere and human, without exposing more complex vulnerabilities. Example: I tend to be hard on myself when I make mistakes, but it pushes me to improve. Overthinking. Why it's easy to admit. Overthinking is a highly relatable flaw, especially in today's fast-paced, high-pressure world. It shows a tendency to be thoughtful and cautious rather than rash or careless. Deeper perspective. Overthinking can be linked to anxiety or insecurity, but it's often admitted in a way that highlights its positive side. Careful consideration. Example: I sometimes overanalyze situations, but it helps me anticipate potential problems. Emotional sensitivity. Why it's easy to admit, being emotionally sensitive can humanize a person and make them seem relatable. It's a slightly harder admission than others on this list, but is still viewed positively when framed as empathy. Deeper perspective. This flaw is easier to admit in personal contexts, where emotional connection matters more. It may evoke understanding rather than judgment. Example: I take things to heart sometimes, but it's because I care so deeply about others. Being a people pleaser. Why it's easy to admit. Admitting to being a people pleaser conveys kindness and a desire to create harmony. However, it also shows a struggle with setting boundaries, which makes it relatable. Deeper perspective. People-pleasing behaviors can stem from deeper insecurities, but they're often presented in a way that highlights compassion rather than vulnerability. Example: I have a hard time saying no because I want to make others happy. Spoiling loved ones. Why it's easy to admit, this flaw feels endearing rather than problematic. It shows generosity and care while subtly reinforcing positive traits. Deeper perspective. It's a great example of a relational flaw that's perceived as a strength when admitted with humor or humility. Example: I tend to spoil my partner too much. It's hard not to when I enjoy making them happy. Admitting these flaws often reflects a balance between self-awareness and social acceptability. Each confession is carefully curated to appear authentic without risking judgment. Now we arrive at the end of the video. Do you think I have missed any safe flaws in the list? Please share it in the comments. Your support to my channel is always appreciated.